Hey Sugar Geeks, Liz here. Every year I make a gingerbread house, but this year I decided to make a baby Yoda, or baby Grogu if you watch the show The Mandolorian and you know that's his real name now. A lot of things went right on this project, but also a lot of things went wrong, and I'm going to tell you about them along the way. So the first thing I did was I wanted to make the pod out of some leftover gingerbread cookie dough. A lot of people always ask me, can they use my gingerbread cookie dough to make like gingerbread houses? And so I was like, I don't know, let's give it a try. So I rolled out my cookie dough and tried to make it about as thin as you would make a typical gingerbread cookie. And then I rolled that up and placed that over the top of my half sphere cake pan, and I covered it in some tin foil so that I could take the gingerbread cookie off the pan. I was worried that it might stick. So I went ahead and baked that in the oven for about an hour, and I could immediately tell it was not going to work out. It had slid down the bowl, it was super thick, it just looked very sloppy, so I basically knew, okay, I'm going to have to go ahead and make some actual construction grade gingerbread. And then I also took this opportunity to make it a little bit lighter in color by using half molasses and half corn syrup, and I was much happier with how this pod turned out. So this construction grade gingerbread dough is a lot easier to handle. I did the same process, I just pushed it over the top of the pan. I smoothed it out with a fondant smoother to make sure I didn't have any cracks or anything. Trimmed off the bottom so it was nice and flat, and then I went ahead and added like some detail pieces, like a long skinny strip kind of around the bottom edge to make it look more like the pod. I cut out some circles of the dough to act as little gears for the sides. And then I went ahead and added some detail scratches by just using the tip of my knife to kind of scratch out some scuff marks to make it look a little bit more realistic. And then I also made the top part of the pod using the same kind of pan and some cake goop so it didn't stick. And then I just cut off the excess dough with like my ruler and added a couple detail lines. And then I cut a small hole out of the bottom of the pod to make room for the carriage bolt that's going to support the pod and make it look like it's exploding. Then I put them into the freezer to freeze for about an hour and then baked them for about 50 minutes until they were nice and firm. So then I decided to start working on my little baby Yoda, or baby Grogu. I'm never going to get used to saying his name like that. Baby Grogu's head. And I don't know why I thought that I could do this, but I was like, oh yeah, I'm just going to sculpt his head out of gingerbread cookie dough and it's going to look great. And I literally worked on this for maybe 2 minutes and, just like sculpting his eyes and thinking about his nose. I have a little toy that I was looking at for reference and making his little mouth, and I'm noticing that the cookie dough is like really hard to kind of get any details. And then you can almost tell right about here, I'm just like, wait a minute. I have this toy that's exactly the size that I need it to be. Maybe I can use it to make a mold. I can see the gears working. So I had a tiny bit of this leftover amazing mold putty. It's a food safe silicone, comes in part A, part B. You need the two putties together and then you can mold it onto objects like this little baby Yoda toy that I have. And you just have to be careful to kind of just press down evenly so that you get all the details and everything. And it was kind of stressful because if I, didn't do this right, I had literally no leftover putty, and so kind of all my eggs were in one basket. I wrapped it around the head all the way up to the ears and just sort of crossed my fingers. It takes about 25 minutes to set. All right, time to demold the toy, see if it turned out. I was genuinely surprised that it turned out this good. Like it captured so much detail. I was shocked. And then after I freaked out and showed my husband and like was super excited and made him go to the store to go get more mold putty, I was like, okay, now I have to mold the rest of this guy. I added a little bit of mold putty to the inside of his eyes so that when I molded the gingerbread inside of it, there would be like a little space where I could fill it in with isomalt because I wanted his eyes to be shiny. So I went ahead and molded the back of his head, and that was really easy. I just tried to line it up with that center seam of the toy so I knew how much gingerbread to put in there. And then I did the same thing with the ears. Then to make the gingerbread green, I just literally added a little bit of leaf green food coloring and kneaded it into the gingerbread, and it made like the perfect little baby Grogu color. And then I just pushed that into the mold, and I tried to make it about a 1/4 inch thick. You know, you don't want it to be too thick because first of all, it's gonna take a really long time to bake, and your chances of it not baking through are higher, and then gingerbread that's not baked all the way through tends to crack and kind of collapse, as we will find out a little bit later. But yeah, for the faces, it worked pretty easily. I just kind of pushed it up to the edges, and then I trimmed them flat as I could. And then I added a little piece of tin foil on the inside to kind of keep the gingerbread from collapsing in on itself. Gingerbread has a hard time, like it needs something to sit on or some sort of support, or it will move a little bit during baking. And I also froze all of my pieces, I forgot to say. All of my pieces of the pod, all the pieces of the face, everything, I would freeze in the freezer for like an hour before I baked it. And I think that helped it keep its shape while it was baking. But yeah, if you're gonna go through the expense of making a mold and doing all of this, make sure you just take the time to freeze it as well. And then I went ahead and baked those in the oven all together for about 50 minutes. I think that was my general time that I used for almost everything, was about 50 minutes. So now it's time to demold the pod. These ones turned out so much better. They did not slide down the dome at all. They're nice and smooth, and they came off actually really easily. So yay for practicing. Even I need to practice some things sometimes. I think that there's this conception that I always know exactly what I'm doing, and honestly I don't. I'm always just sort of like filming my process as I'm experimenting, and then I just show you guys which ones worked. So it always looks like I know exactly what I'm doing, but really I just cut out all the parts where it did not work out so well. So now I'm going to trim down the edges of my pods. I'm using my zester. It worked really good to just kind of like flatten out those edges. Be really careful though. When I was doing this, you can see that little crack on the side. I accidentally bumped the outer edge of my pod and broke a piece off. So yeah, just don't do that. So this helped attach all of the pieces together so that they were nice and flat and not ragged at the top. That's the nice thing about this construction grade gingerbread is you can cut it, you can sand it, you can shape it, and it's just super sturdy. Just not great for eating. All right, our little gingerbread head and ears are all baked. I baked them just directly inside the food safe silicone, which is super nice. And look how cute it turned out. I was so happy with how the details turned out. His eyelids were captured, all the little features, way easier, and I think it turned out way better than what I was doing. So yeah, the back of the head obviously turned out super smooth, no problems. The ears turned out really good, although they had a little bit of overflow that I ended up having to trim off to make them fit against the head, which was no big deal. The ears were a little bit thicker, because I couldn't really make them hollow. So when I was trimming them down, I did notice that the centers of the ears was still a little bit soft, but it ended up being okay, and it didn't seem to affect the construction at all. So here I am just using my X-Acto blade to trim down the edges and make sure they're nice and flat. And this was sort of tedious, but it wasn't that bad. I just had to kind of keep fitting them back together to make sure that I was getting them flush. And then the hardest part was trying to make sure that the ears were trimmed properly and fitting up against the head. Okay, so honestly, the hard part I thought was like over, and now I was just gonna put everything together and everything was gonna be fine. So yeah, I made some thick royal icing, the same recipe for my construction grade gingerbread house, and I just colored it with like, you know, a little bit of ivory food coloring, and it matched perfectly with the color of the gingerbread. And then I added a little bit of green, same leaf green that I used to color the gingerbread, to sort of match it with the baby Grogu pieces. I didn't want to see any royal icing seams. It ended up being a tiny bit too dark, but I don't think you could really tell. So I just put that royal icing into a piping bag and glued the back half of baby Grogu's head onto the front, and seamed it up with the royal icing, and it was like, okay, great, this is going good. And then I just, added on the ears, and I thought, all right, this is also going good. But the ears would not stay on. I kept on having to reattach them, and they just like kept falling off. And so I tried putting them on upside down. I tried to put holding them for about a minute, and they just were like not sticking at all. So eventually I figured out that if I put them on plastic wrap and pushed them on and then just walked away very slowly and didn't touch it, they eventually stuck on, and they stopped falling off. But it took like an hour for them to dry. To assemble the pod, same thing, just took some of that royal icing, added some ivory food coloring. I left it a little bit lighter than the pod because I still wanted it to kind of have the look of a gingerbread house, but I didn't want to use white icing. I don't know why. That's just what I did. So I added the top piece onto the bottom and just glued it on with a piping bag, and then I started adding on all my little circular round pieces. I did one on the inside. I cut one to fit in between the inside and the outside, so it kind of looked like a hinge of sorts, and then I did the exact same thing to the other side. And this is where I decided to start piping. I started piping lines on top, started piping things around the edges. I didn't really have a plan. I just kind of went for it, and I'm sure there will be some people that get annoyed with me just piping directly onto the gingerbread pieces like this, and I'm not a really excellent piper. It's not my skill, but I didn't want to just leave it blank, so, please excuse my elementary and basic piping skills. I also added some details to the side of the pod to, just kind of make it look a little bit more interesting. And then I ended up cutting a tiny circle of gingerbread, one of the leftover circular pieces, and added that to the side as well. I don't know why I got so crazy with this detail. I just did. I don't know. Sometimes I just get in the zone. This is not even the focus. Baby Grogu is. So now that the pod is assembled, I needed to kind of figure out how big to make Baby Grogu's body. I just used some aluminum foil to sort of rough it out. And then I put that inside the pod. I was like, okay, that looks about right. And then I colored some of my leftover dough white with some white food coloring. It ended up being kind of a light ivory, which is perfect for his clothes. And then I rolled that out up to about 1/4 inch and then wrapped that around the aluminum foil. And my original plan was to wrap it around, bake it, and then cut it in half on the sides, and then glue it back together once it was inside the pod. But that did not happen, and I'll tell you why. So here I am just using his head to kind of gauge about where it's going to be when it's done baking, and then I froze it, and then I put it inside a pan that was the same size as the pod because I needed it to kind of bake with an angle in the front. I put this bowl pan into a 6-inch pan so that it would not roll around and would sit at the right angle. I also rolled out a thin strip of the dough and textured it with a fork to make it look like his little scarf of fur, I guess you could call it. And I wrapped that around the top, overlapped it, put the head on top one more time for just placement. And I'm like, yay, it's gonna look super cute. I'm very confident. I also very quickly made some hands out of the green gingerbread dough. I just used my X-Acto blade to sort of shape it into this little 3-finger hand. In hindsight, I feel like I could have made them a little bit smaller because while this dough doesn't necessarily spread, it does puff a little bit, and when you're working with things that are so small, they end up getting kind of big. So I wish I would have made this a little bit smaller, but it's fine. It's totally fine. We're all fine. I wrapped his arm in some more of that whitish gingerbread dough, added a little cuff of fur, and then I baked it on top of a piece of tin foil to help it hold its shape. And I froze it first before I baked it. I also took some of my leftover dough and put it on top of a pan, and I was going to make some panels for the top and the back of the dome, but only one of the panels ended up turning out. The other one, when it baked, it just kind of slid down the side and did not look right, so I ended up only using the top panel. Again, I did freeze it, but I don't know, it gingerbread dough just does not do well when it's standing straight up like that. So this is just a 4-inch carriage bolt. I don't know why it's called that, but you can get them at the hardware store, and has just like a little flat piece on the end. I drilled a hole with a 1/4-inch bit, put it up through the bottom of my cake board, and then I just secured it down with a 1/4-inch nut. I didn't use any locking washers because this is not a heavy cake, it's actually very light, so I figured this would be enough. And then I just put the gingerbread pod on top just to make sure that it was at the right height. But before I secured it down, I went ahead and covered the whole board with some marshmallow fluff, which I thought would kind of be fluffy and would look like snow, but it did not. I was surprised the next day to see that most of the marshmallow fluff ran off the board and puddled onto my dining room table. So yeah, probably will not use this again, but I had a whole jar of it, so I mean, it worked for what I was using it for, I guess. I used some sprinkles around the edge to kind of make it look a little icy, but yeah, those ran off the board too. So then I went ahead and secured the pod on top. So I just put a nut about 1 inch up from the board and then a washer on top of that, and then that's what the gingerbread sits on top of so it doesn't slide down the bolt. Then I just secured the top with another nut and another washer, and just tighten up that it doesn't wiggle around too much. And I also put some royal icing down in there so that it would harden overnight and keep it a little bit more secure. Then I went ahead and added that one little panel that ended up working out and added some piping around the edge to make it look interesting, but yeah, the other panels didn't work out. So here is the body. It had some problems. It started to kind of collapse in the oven, and I think it's just because it was too thick. So he's a little bit shorter and squishier than he was when I first put him in there. But I still used it, and he looks fine. It looks fine, I noticed, but I ended up just leaving the foil inside the body because nobody's eating this, and I was afraid that his body was not going to hold together, so I just left it. To make the eyes, I just melted down some isomalt, added some black food coloring, and just drizzled it into those empty slots that I made. I had to be really careful though because they wanted to drip out the side, and I was so terrified that it was going to drip out the side and ruin everything, so I was just like super careful, only dripping in enough isomalt so that the eyes looked, full but not super full. And then I had to literally hold it in place until the eye cooled so it wouldn't drip, and then I could do the other side. So then his eyes were nice and shiny. I really like how they look. After the eyes are all cool, I added some more royal icing to the top of the body and secured the head on, and I think he actually looked really good. For the arms, I ended up having to trim them down quite a bit to make them fit against the body. Like I said, they were a little bit too big. But after I trimmed them down, I think they looked fine, and I just secured them on with some royal icing. I wanted his left arm to be raised up, so I just put some plastic wrap underneath of it until it dried. And at the last moment, I just decided to take a little bit of Rainbow Dust Silver food color paint and just kind of dry brush over the surface of the pod just to give it a little bit more interest. I didn't want to completely cover the gingerbread because the whole point of this is it's supposed to look like gingerbread, but I thought just the plain gingerbread looked a little bit too plain, so yeah, just a little bit of dry brushing here and there. And it kind of brings out the texture of the gingerbread too, which makes it look even more rustic, and I even put a little bit on top of his head to kind of look like the fuzzy fur that he has. And then I didn't have any footage of this on my camera, but I literally went to the store and looked everywhere for a little silver ball to use to be floating in the air and could not find one. And then I was like, duh, I have about 1,000 sphere molds. So I just melted down some more isomalt, added some silver luster dust, and then poured a little sphere into my sphere mold. And then when it popped out, I torched it a little bit to make it smooth, and then I attached that to some fishing line and kind of hung it from just my Archon mount to make it look like it was just floating right above his hand. You could totally see the wire, but I don't even care. At this point, I've given up, and it is what it is. He's not perfect, but I do kind of love him, and I'm really excited that he's going to be another permanent fixture in my studio next to my other little baby Yoda. So yeah, I hope you guys have stuck around. I'm sorry I talked so much, but I wanted to show you all of the details of making this. I hope you like this little baby Grogu gingerbread project as much as I did. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and I will see you guys after the new year. Bye!